Hey there, I'm going to try to continue with John 3 again. Honestly, this is my, um, I don't know, second or third time trying this. I keep going off on these little tangents, and I really don't want to in this case. I want to get through and stay. Uh, I want to get through it. uh, so we've passed up Nicodemus. We've gone through his conversation. He went back home and went to bed. And now we are after these things, right? John 3:22. After these things came Jesus and his disciples to the land of Judea, and there he tarried with them and baptized. And John also was baptizing in Aenon near to Salim, because there was much water there, and they came and were baptized. So it's for John was not yet cast into prison. It's interesting that you've got two groups of people baptizing now. Um, there there's just, you have to ask, why didn't John follow Jesus? And he's still baptizing. Why? Because he hasn't been cast into prison. In other words, only the physical end is going to stop him. And that sounds really negative. I don't think that's the case, but I've always wondered about that. And somebody else asked me the question recently, I don't know, a little while ago. Why did John have to be beheaded? I mean, it's such a terrible ending. He sees Christ and now he's got to go off and be imprisoned. Why did God do that, Well, John was perfectly clear about his role. And you have to remember what Jesus said about John was that the law and the prophets were until John. And he was the greatest of all men born of women. That includes Solomon, that includes Abraham, that includes everybody other than Jesus himself up until that time. Um, and yet, Jesus said, he that is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than him. So you may not be like a classical dispensationalist. Maybe you don't believe in dispensations, but there is clearly a marked transition going on here between the old and the new. Christ is about to come and replace everything that the law, the priesthood, and the temple and Moses points to. He is the reality. He's about to replace it all, um, by his own death and resurrection. And he's going to become the high priest with a new priesthood, a new order, a heavenly priesthood, a heavenly temple. Um, and everything that went before was just a picture pointing to him, and John is the sum of it all. And he came to prepare the way for Christ and point to him, which he did. Um, but John is still of the old, and uh, he's too much of a figure of the old, I think. He couldn't just fall in line and follow Jesus and be discipled by Jesus. He was the end of something. The law and the prophets came through Moses, but or the law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. There's a new thing on the horizon, and John was there to basically sum up and really bring the old to bear. He brought the law and the prophets to bear, especially the law. He preached in such a way that people were willing to put themselves in the water, um, out in the wilderness. We talked about this. Apart from it was a recognition that, number one, their temple and their priesthood and their law wasn't enough, because if it was, why would they go out to the wilderness to see this homeless, camel haired, clothed, uh, fasting, wild haired prophet? You know, why would they all go out there if everything they needed was in Jerusalem? He was there to prepare them for something new by using the law to show them why something new was happening. You know, the the law had become watered down and added to. Um, a good example of that is the purification rites, and we're going to see that that's brought up again here. The earthly purification rites that have been added, represented by those 6 vessels of water in the marriage feast of Cana. Uh, the purification of the Jews was all these practices that were added according to the traditions of men to clean cups and bowls and everything to maintain separation, but it was all an earthly separation. It didn't actually make you holy. And Jesus, rebuked the Pharisees for that because they had the outward form of a supposed holiness and all this purification and washing, which was according to their tradition. And yet they didn't let the law penetrate to their heart and show them their actual need for deliverance. And so inwardly, they were still full of all kinds of indulgence and evil and idolatry and adultery in their hearts. They didn't even care about God hardly anymore. They only cared about their religious forms, at least the Pharisees. Well, John came preaching the law and said the axe is going to be laid to the root of the tree, and God is done. And there's one coming who's going to purge out the threshing floor, and his fan is in his hand, and he preached that this one is coming to judge everything. And people, in preparation for that, went into the water, those who received the message and were willing to be baptized. Um, anyway, so John's ministry is really using the law and and putting it back in effect in a sense in its actual purpose, which the purpose of the law is to condemn sin and convict you for your need for Christ. That's how he used it. But it was a law ministry. And Jesus actually had a law ministry too, but he also had a grace ministry. There's an overlap. It's the dispensational change. The law is, according to Hebrews, uh, waxing old, and kind of it's fading out and disappearing and being eclipsed and fulfilled and uh, realized in Christ. So now everybody needs to come to him. And John was too much of a figure. And he still had his disciples. There were disciples who didn't go and follow Jesus. They stayed with John. Why is that? And that, I think, is why he had to decrease, which he's going to say here. He must increase, I must decrease. He had to. He had to be put out of the way, and he realized that. Because his ministry was not appropriate for what was next. So it's just kind of interesting. John was not yet cast in prison. He's baptizing. Jesus is baptizing, or at least his disciples were. There's 2 groups of people baptizing. And so that produced some confusion. And then it says, there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. And it's interesting because purification keeps coming up. Ever since we saw those 6 vessels at the marriage feast of Cana, there's been several references to the Jews and their purification. There's the washing which was by the traditions of men. And then there's Christ, who does the real purification as the Lamb who takes away the sins, and as the one who enters into the temple and overturns the money changers and the merchandisers, and as the bronze serpent who really condemns sin in his own flesh, and as the wine. He's also the wine at that wedding feast. That was a kind of purifying wine. See, look at this. Then there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. Now that shows up in the other Gospels. For example, Mark 2. Here we go. Sorry. Um, I'm going to find it. I promise. Oh, here it is. 18. And the disciples of John and the Pharisees used to fast. And they come and say to him, why do the disciples of John and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples fast not? And Jesus said to them, can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. But the days will come when the bridegroom shall be taken away from them, and they will fast in those days. So, um, he's speaking there of his death. When he died and was buried, he told his disciples, look, the world is going to rejoice and you're going to mourn when I'm going to be taken away from you, but then you're going to see me again. And they said, how are we going to see you again in a way that the world can't see you? Well, I'm going to send you the Spirit. So in the day of resurrection, that was their time of rejoicing, which incidentally, when the Spirit came out and was poured out upon them, it's likened to new wine. These men are drunk with new wine, right? There was so much joy. But the disciples of John and the Pharisees had disciples too, they're all fasting. And it must have been noticeable. Like you could see that they're fasting. Which, if you remember, Jesus said, when you fast, don't make a big show about it. Don't even let people know. But at that time, the practice was if you were fasting, everybody knew you were fasting and miserable. You let everybody know because it was a show of your spirituality for the Pharisees, you know. But he said, your disciples fast. They said, your disciples fast not. Jesus' disciples didn't fast. So there's a difference, and it's different enough that it's noticeable. People are seeing the liberty that Jesus and his disciples have and exercise. And what's his answer? Can the children of the bride chamber fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. So the presence of the bridegroom eliminates the need for fasting. It's very interesting. This question about purification, how do we purify ourselves, is important because of their sin consciousness. And yet Jesus is introducing something new. What's he introducing? Himself as wine and as satisfaction. And that satisfaction accomplishes the purification that they sought. They sought it by tradition, they sought it by the law, they sought it by outward forms and never could obtain the reality. Christ is the reality. This is Christ as sanctification. Not just justification, but he is the way to be purified. We all have a desire to be pure. Even a man naturally has a desire to be pure. Some people give themselves over to impurity. But let's say you're a Buddhist monk. What is their pursuit? Their pursuit is a kind of purity. But we need it as God defines it. What is purity? Purity is having Christ. Purity means your eye is single and you behold Christ. And your enjoyment is Christ. And your satisfaction is Christ. And you're betrothed to Christ as a pure virgin, and he's your bridegroom. And your joy comes from the love, from the marriage with him. He's the bridegroom. And he even says, no man puts new wine into old bottles, lest the new wine both burst the bottles and the wine is spilled and the bottles will be marred, but the new wine must be put into new bottles. Now here he's talking about the need to be a new creation, but notice that the wine and the marriage go together. Just like at Cana, it's the same thing. And I believe that this is the same conversation that John is referring to. This shows up in all the Gospels, where John's disciples and the Jews have a dispute about purification. And when they went to Jesus about it, Jesus answered and said, look, my disciples don't fast because the bridegroom is with them. I'm sure they had no idea what he's talking about. So then they went back to John. Here's the conversation from John's point of view. Does John say something different? No, he says the same thing. Look, okay, there arose a question between some of John's disciples and the Jews about purifying. And they came unto John and said to him, Rabbi, he that was beyond the Jordan with thee, to whom you bore witness, behold, the same baptize, and all men come to him. Okay, so first there's the question between the Jews and John's disciples about purifying, which we saw in the other gospel, they apparently went to Jesus too. And then here they're coming back to John to ask him, number one, about the same thing, but also the fact that Jesus is baptizing and you're losing your crowd, right? John answered and said, a man can receive nothing except it is given to him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but I am sent before him. He that has the bride is the bridegroom. But the friend of the bridegroom, which stands and hears him, rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. This my joy is therefore fulfilled. He must increase, but I must decrease. So he's saying, look, I'm not the Christ, so it's right for him to be, he is the Christ, number one. And number two, he has the bride, and he's the bridegroom. Again, it's no accident that John puts the fact that there was question between John's disciples and the Jews about purifying here. The Holy Spirit is linking purification with one of two things. Either man's attempts to purify himself, or Christ being the reality of purification, the reality of sanctification. And you really have one or the other, because one is earthly and one is heavenly. John said, I'm a friend of the bridegroom. That means John's not even part of the bride. He didn't consider himself part of the bride, which that's a whole nother issue. But he's a friend of the bridegroom, which is an interesting role. There is a role called the friends of the bridegroom, which it has a service function in the kingdom, but isn't the same as the body of Christ. And that's important to think about when you read parables and stuff, like the parable of the virgins and the servants and stuff like that. There are parables that Jesus spoke of that don't technically apply to the church. There's another group, the remnant of Israel, that serves God, the servants of God. Just side note. But Christ is the bridegroom. And this is both Jesus and John's answer to questions about purification. That's just really interesting. Just think about it. And remember, at the wedding of Cana, there were the 6 vessels set aside for the Jews' purification rites, which was just an empty tradition of men that they kept to try to keep everything kosher. And Jesus drew wine out of that, almost as a joke. He had them draw wine out of that. The miracle he did was right in the midst of that purification rite. He brought the satisfaction to the wedding feast, and he put it in the context of purification for those who had eyes to see. The disciples saw his miracle. Most of the people didn't know where the wine came from, but the disciples knew. They remembered it came out of those purification vessels. They remembered that those vessels were for purification, and yet he's drawing the wine for the feast out of it. Jesus is wanting us to see the marriage feast, him as the bridegroom, our role as the bride, our relationship to him in love, and the wine that it produces. He wants us to see that as the heavenly answer to purification. The desire to be purified, the desire that causes us to go to that purifying water of ordinances. It's not purifying water. It doesn't even work. When you try to keep the law and when you try to keep yourself separate by your own effort, that doesn't necessarily make you into something more spiritual or heavenly. And heavenly is the point, okay? Because he that comes from above is above all. That's speaking of Christ. He that is of the earth is earthly and speaks of the earth. He that comes from heaven is above all. And Jesus said the same thing to Nicodemus. We speak to you of things we've seen, heavenly things. Only the Son of Man has ascended to heaven, and you don't receive our witness. And I said he was talking about the witness of God, the Spirit, and Christ. And John is saying the same thing. Look, everything I've been talking about is earthly. Even when I used the law to bring people into the waters of baptism, I was still speaking of something earthly, preparatory. Now this one is coming. The bridegroom is here. He has the bride. I'm just his friend, and yeah, I rejoice to hear his voice, but I must decrease. He's got to increase. And if you have questions about purification, the answer is that he's the bridegroom. You have questions about should I fast? The answer is that he is the bridegroom. And while the bridegroom is with you, you can't fast. Now, I don't want to get into a big thing about fasting because we know that Paul fasted, Peter fasted. There were times of fasting that even the apostles kept after the resurrection of Christ. But I will say that God said in Isaiah, "Isn't this the fast that I've chosen, that you to relieve the burden and to remove the pointing of the finger and to break the yoke and to supply the needy?" And isn't that what the gospel does? Isn't that what Christ does? He removes the burden, the yoke, with his anointing. He breaks the yoke and the obligation, and also removes the pointing finger, because if he forgave me, I can't judge you. And the pointing finger comes from the law. The law is what causes people to point fingers at people. If you're pointing fingers at someone, it's because you've got a law concept of how they should behave or whatever, you know. And again, I don't want to get into that too much, but we want purification to be about earthly things. But purification is about something heavenly. It's about you being made heavenly and being fitted for someone who is heavenly. And he is the qualification. Anyway, he says, "He that comes from above is above all. He that is of earth is earthly, and speaks of the earth. And he that comes from heaven is above all. And what he has seen and heard, he testified. And no one receives his testimony." Jesus said the same thing to Nicodemus. "He that receives his testimony has set his seal that God is true. For God, he whom God sends, speaks the words of God. For God gives not the Spirit by measure to him. For the Father loves the Son and has given all things to his hand. He that believes in the Son has everlasting life. He that believes not the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abide on him." Now, I would think that John's disciples at that point would have gone and become Jesus' disciples. They should have left John and followed Jesus. And that was a reason, I think, one of the reasons why God had to take John out of the way. Because once Jesus was manifested and declared, people needed to follow him. So that's just my view of that. But the main point I wanted to make is, and you know, I'm not an evangelist. Some people, their ministry is about making sure you understand how to be saved. My thing is really, okay, now that I'm saved, how do I get spiritual reality into my life? And some people think I teach an extreme form of rest that doesn't involve any reality of sanctification. And that's not true. But my point is that Christ is our sanctification. And in John, sanctification, real sanctification, the reality of sanctification, heavenly sanctification that makes you heavenly, is about an atmosphere in your heart that's produced by satisfaction that comes from Christ. Are you satisfied with Christ? If you're satisfied with Christ, there's nothing you need. Seriously. So many people think that they have lost their way, spiritually speaking, because they aren't maintaining the practices they used to keep. I don't read the Bible as much as I used to, or I don't pray as much as I used to, or I watch more TV than I should. All of those things are secondary and earthly. The heavenly thing is Christ, the bridegroom. And that's what you need. You need to come back to Christ, the bridegroom. He's in your heart. He's in your spirit. Remember I said we need to read John in the way it was intended. It was written to the church. It was written to a group of people who were regenerated already to bring them back to the foundation. because they left their first love. And their first love is not their love for Christ, it's their realization of his love for them. God loves us and gave his son for us that we might live through him, that he would be our life. And the way that life is lived is supposed to be by satisfaction, not by trying to purify yourself. It's literally by being consumed with Christ. It's that desire for fellowship that I talked about in the last message. Regeneration creates in us a new source of feelings and desires for something we never had before. It was a desire for fellowship and to know Christ. That wasn't there before I was saved. That's there now. And that is the thirst that drives the Christian life. That's really what it is. And we misidentify it all the time. We turn it into, well, I need to wash my hands. Because it is true that when we're really thirsty, we also feel unclean. We tend to feel defiled because this world defiles us. But remember, Jesus said you're already clean because of the word I've spoken to you. You just need your feet washed. And he's the one to wash your feet. And he does it in intimacy. And he does it in the context of a wedding feast. The idea is, remember, you're my bride. And remember Ephesians 5. See, again, I've said that John is built on Ephesians. You can see all the Ephesians truths shining through John. He went back to Ephesus to minister these truths back to the church that left its first love, to bring them back to the beginning, to bring them back to Christ as everything. And in Ephesians 5, remember, Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might present her to himself glorious through the washing of the water of the word. Through the way he sanctifies is by satisfying and nourishing and cherishing the bride. And it uses the example, of a man and a woman, and no husband hates his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it. So also Christ loved the church. He takes care of us. He wants to be our purity. He wants to wash us. He wants to cleanse us. And John's showing us that, look, well, the Gospels do too, but John emphasizes it a lot, that questions about purification, really, who's your bridegroom? Because remember in Romans 7 that the law is likened to a husband. We were married to that husband, and we couldn't be married to Christ while we were married to it because it would have been adultery. And we were bound to the law as long as that husband lived. We were bound to him. Well, that husband doesn't die, so we died. Romans 7 says that we died to the law so that we may be married to Christ or joined to Christ, that we may bear fruit to God. We had to die to get out of that marriage. So the question of purification really is, who is your husband? Is it the law? Is it something earthly? If you just are thinking about, I should watch less TV and read more Bible and pray more so I can get back to that place where I used to be, you are thinking you're like 6 vessels of water for washing. You're thinking about washing your hands. You're thinking about purification, and you're thinking about earthly things. Your mind is set on earthly things, believe it or not. But when you lift up your eyes to see the bridegroom, which is how John and Jesus both directed this question about purification, was to see that Christ is the bridegroom. You realize that the key is the satisfying love of Christ for you. That is how you'll be washed. If you don't come to the Lord and come to the Word and come to your prayer by putting yourself into a realization, Christ loves me. Christ loved the church. He gave himself for me. He betrothed me to himself. He condescended to become a lowly man, to court me and to win me and to woo me and to draw me and make me so attracted to him because he knows the good things he has for me because he loved me. And now when I come to him, he's going to wash me. He's going to take care of me. He's going to cherish me. He's going to nourish me. He doesn't hate his own flesh. He loves his flesh. He loves me. We're one. I'm a member of his body. He's my head. If you have that kind of realization when you come to your prayer or when you come to the Word, then you won't be thinking about how much Word are you reading or how much prayer you're doing. You'll be thinking about Christ. And he will turn that desire for purification into satisfaction with him as wine. See what I'm saying? It's the same thing I said at the beginning in John 2 with the marriage feast of Cana. Yes, there is times where he deals with us in disciplined ways where there's crisis, like when he came into the temple. But that's not because of us. That's because somebody made merchandise of us, and he's got to overturn all the concepts. He's got to do warfare in us to get rid of the concepts that are keeping us from enjoying him as the bridegroom. But the normal Christian life really should be one of being satisfied with Christ. And then that takes care of everything. It really does. That will fill you with the Spirit. That will give you the wine. That's putting on the new wineskin. And that is what purification is. And that's heavenly. That's why people don't understand it. The natural man, if I talk about sanctification in this way, the natural man rejects it. The legalist rejects it. Why? Because they're earthly minded. He that speaks of the earth is earthly, but he that speaks from heaven is from heaven. And no man receives his witness. No man can receive this kind of testimony. It has to be the work of God in us. And that's another thing all the way through these chapters is we keep seeing he came to his own, but they received him not, but those that received him. To them he gave power to become the children of God. Well, if his own didn't receive him, then how did they receive him? Because God came in and did something that they couldn't do. Because they were born, not of the will of the flesh, nor of man, nor of blood, but of God. Only God can beget us and bring us out of this rejection of spiritual things. And we all by nature reject spiritual things. We reject heavenly truth. We don't understand it. But eventually, hi, my son came in. Sorry. Eventually, do you need something? I'm almost done. What do you need?
So can I have ice cream?
Go ask your mom. Sorry, I'm almost done here. What was I saying? Oh yeah. Only God can bring us to a process where we're finally willing and able to receive heavenly things. And that's really the issue with John's disciples. John had disciples, and what was he doing? He was pointing them to Jesus. But they stayed with John, and they stayed with the old ways of purification, and are arguing with the Jews about fasting and praying and different purification methods. Meanwhile, Jesus is over there with his new disciples, got a whole new ministry, and they know about Christ, but they haven't gone to him. What's their issue? They're not ready to receive heavenly things yet. They're not ready to see him as a bridegroom. They still are veiled by the law. And I think that a lot of Christians are there that they believe, but they don't enjoy Christ. They don't know how to come to him in that way, and they don't perceive spiritual and heavenly things. So when you talk about sanctification in this way, they think you're just talking about a license to sin. If you're not keeping law, and if you're not washing your hands, and if you're not telling people how to read their Bible more and pray more, then they're not going to have a spiritual life if you just talk about Christ. No, if I tell you about Christ and make him attractive to you, then I'm betrothing to you to him. That's a betrothing ministry. That's what Paul called, he said, I betrothed you as a pure virgin to Christ. How do you betroth someone to Christ? Well, the only way I know is to tell people about Christ, and then hopefully they'll be attracted to him and drawn to him. And then they'll say, yeah, I want to be with him. And then whatever happens to you is not the point. The point is that people come to Jesus and enjoy him. And as they do, he will be their satisfaction. He will be their purification. He will be their sanctification. Okay, I'm finally done with this. This is my fourth time trying to do this message. It was really hard for me to get the essence of it. All right, talk to you later.